He came home smelling like her perfume. That was the first thing Nia noticed. Not the timestamp on his phone, not the lipstick smear she'd spotted 3 weeks before and told herself meant nothing. It was the perfume. Something expensive and foreign that clung to his collar like a second skin while their newborn son slept 20 feet away in a bassinet Lucian had never once looked into without being prompted. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He walked past her like she was furniture, like she was one of the marble pillars holding up that penthouse, poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, and told her she looked tired. She looked tired. Their son was 6 weeks old. If that were you, if the person who vowed to protect you walked through your door at 2 a.m., smelling like another woman, and had the audacity to criticize your face, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this one shake something loose in you, if you find yourself holding your breath and leaning closer, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Nia Bennett did not grow up expecting to be rescued. That matters. Understand that about her before anything else, because the kind of woman who expects rescue is a different kind of woman entirely. And Nia was not her. She grew up in Baltimore, third of 4 children, in a house where the heat sometimes went out in January, and her mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry facility and never once complained loud enough for her children to hear it. Nia heard it anyway. She heard it in the quiet way her mother ate less when money was short, the way she saved the best cuts of chicken for the kids and told herself she wasn't hungry. That image never left Nia. It lived somewhere behind her sternum, pressed there like a fingerprint, and it was part of what drove her through nursing school, through the brutal overnight shifts in the trauma bay, through the years of absorbing other people's worst moments and still showing up the next day. She became excellent at her job not because she was fearless, she was afraid constantly, in that particular fluorescent-lit way of emergency medicine, but because she had been trained by her own life to function inside fear without surrendering to it. She was 31 when she met Lucian Vescari. She was working a Sunday evening shift when 2 men came through the ER doors. One of them was bleeding from a wound in his side that he refused to explain. The other stood back near the wall, composed, watchful, wearing a suit that cost more than Nia's monthly rent, and watched her work with an attention that made the hair on her arms stand up. She focused on the patient. That was her job. "He's going to need a CT scan and probably surgery," she told the man in the suit, not looking at him. "Who do I contact?" "Me," the man said. She looked at him then. Lucian Vescari was 43 at the time, with the kind of face that had been through weather. Not handsome in any soft way, but striking, with dark eyes that assessed you before you'd finished your first sentence. He was Italian-American, old New York family money layered over something older and more dangerous that she wouldn't fully understand until much later. "Are you family?" she asked. "Close enough." She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then returned to her patient. Lucian noticed. Most people in Nia's world noticed when she did that, when she refused to be rattled. Her colleagues had a name for it. They called it her trauma face, the ability to stand in the middle of chaos and become very, very still. He came back 3 days later, not as a patient, not with anyone injured. He came alone and he asked her to have dinner with him. Nia said no. He came back a week after that. She said no again, but she thought about him on the drive home, which irritated her. The 3rd time, she said yes. Not because he'd worn her down, but because something about the persistence felt different from arrogance. It felt like a man who had decided she was worth the effort and was willing to prove it. That distinction would cost her years of her life. Their early relationship moved in a way that Nia, looking back, would describe as deliberately controlled, though she didn't see the control at the time. She saw a man who paid attention, who asked about her shifts and remembered details, who flew her to Rome for a weekend in February and watched her face when she saw the Pantheon like the building meant nothing to him, and she meant everything. He was not careless with her. Not then. He was precise. And precision, she had learned in the trauma bay, was what separated people who saved lives from people who just stood near them. She fell in love with the precision. She married him 18 months after they met. The wedding was small by his world standards. 60 people. A restaurant he'd rented in its entirety on the Upper East Side, a dress she'd chosen herself without his input because he'd insisted she pick whatever she wanted, and she'd taken him at his word. He placed the ring on her finger and said her name like it was something he'd been waiting to say out loud. And she felt, for the first time in her adult life, like someone who had chosen well. That feeling lasted almost a year. The first sign wasn't dramatic, it never is. It was a conversation about a joint bank account that he suggested they delay setting up. Just until my accountant finishes the quarterly review. It's complicated, you know how it is. She didn't know how it was, but she trusted him and she let it go. The second sign came when his attorney, a thin, dry man named Hargrove, who smelled of old paper and whose smile never reached his eyes, asked her to sign a document she hadn't had time to fully read. Lucian was in the room. He told her it was routine. She signed. Looking back, that moment would become one of the sharpest splinters in her memory. Not because of what was in the document, though what was in it would surface later and flatten her, but because of what she'd done. She had overridden her own instincts out of love. She had handed a stranger her signature because the man she loved had called it routine. She never made that mistake again. But the cost of learning it was extraordinarily high. By the time Nia was 7 months pregnant, the pattern had solidified in ways she was only beginning to name. Lucian controlled every account. The penthouse, their home, was titled exclusively in his name. She drove a car registered to one of his LLCs. She had a credit card that fed from a household account he'd created for her, with a spending limit he'd set without asking her preference. She hadn't noticed any of this arriving. It had come incrementally, piece by piece, the way water erodes stone, not in a single catastrophic flood, but in the daily patient work of reshaping what's beneath. When she pointed this out to him, carefully, because she was already learning that carefulness was necessary, he looked at her with genuine confusion. "I take care of you," he said. "That's what this is. I know how to take care of myself." "I know you do." He said it warmly, like a compliment. "But you don't have to anymore." She stood in their kitchen at 7 months pregnant and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that they were not having the same conversation. He believed he was loving her. She believed she was disappearing. She didn't know how to bridge that distance yet. So she did what she had always done when she didn't know what to do. She waited. She watched. She kept working. Micah was born on a Tuesday night in early April. Nia went into labor at 2 p.m. It was 6 weeks early. Her blood pressure had been climbing for days, which she'd known because she was a nurse and she'd been monitoring herself quietly without telling Lucian because she didn't want to worry him, and if she was honest with herself, fully honest, because she didn't want him to tell her she was overreacting. She called him when the contractions started. Voicemail. She called again 20 minutes later. Voicemail. She texted 3 times. Then she called their driver, Marcus, who was at her door in 11 minutes, and she rode to the hospital sitting upright and breathing through her nose alone, while Manhattan moved past the windows in its usual indifferent way. Micah was born at 11:47 p.m. He was 5 pounds, 2 ounces. He came into the world screaming, which the delivery nurse said was excellent. It meant his lungs were strong. Nia lay there listening to that sound, that furious, insistent sound, and felt something in her chest crack open in a way that had no name. Lucian arrived at 1:15 a.m. He came in carrying flowers, white peonies, her favorite, which told her he'd called someone to arrange them. And he stood in the doorway of her hospital room with genuine emotion on his face, something raw and unguarded that she hadn't seen in months. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," he said. She looked at him over the head of their sleeping son. "Where were you?" "There was an issue I had to handle personally. I came as fast as I could." She didn't ask again, not because she believed him, because she was holding a human being she'd brought into the world alone, and she didn't have room, in that moment, for anything as enormous as the truth. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of her life. She already knew newborns were brutal. She'd cared for them professionally. She understood the science of what happened to a body after birth. She'd counseled dozens of patients through postpartum recovery. Knowing and living were not the same country. She was exhausted in a way that reached her bones. Micah fed every 2 to 3 hours through the night, and Nia was the one who woke, who changed him, who walked the floor at 3 a.m. in the enormous silent penthouse while Lucian slept. He offered, twice, to hire a night nurse. She said no. Not out of pride, but because Micah was hers and she wanted to be the one who learned him. Learned the particular rhythm of his breathing, the way he startled at certain sounds, the exact pitch of the cry that meant hunger versus the one that meant discomfort. She was building a map of him, and she needed to do it herself. Lucian stopped offering after the second refusal, which was fine, except that he also stopped waking up, and then he stopped coming home before midnight. Nia noticed, but she filed it under exhaustion, under stress, under the rational category of men who don't know how to be present in the chaos of early parenthood. She had colleagues who'd described this exact dynamic. She told herself it was temporary. Then came the gala. Micah was 9 weeks old. Lucian had mentioned the event. Something connected to one of his legitimate holdings, a real estate investment group, the kind of public-facing business he maintained partly as infrastructure and partly as a very expensive mirror that showed the world a particular image of himself. Nia hadn't planned to attend. She was still nursing, still not sleeping through the night, still wearing her hair in the same 3 rotation styles because she didn't have the mental bandwidth for anything more. But she had a sitter she trusted, and something made her go. A need she couldn't entirely name, a hunger for the world outside those penthouse walls, for the version of herself that had existed before Micah and before all of this. She wore a dark green dress she'd bought 2 years ago and hadn't touched since. It still fit. She was thinner in her face than she'd been, sharper around the edges. She saw Lucian across the room before he saw her. He was standing near the windows, a drink in his hand, and beside him was a woman Nia didn't recognize at first. Tall, blonde, wearing something structured in deep burgundy that caught the light. They were talking. Lucian was smiling in a way Nia hadn't seen in months. And then the woman said something, and Lucian placed his hand, his left hand, his ring hand, against the small of her back, and he leaned in close to hear her response. It was a small gesture. It was also not the gesture of a man who considered himself married. Nia stood still. She was very good at being still. She held her champagne glass with both hands, and she breathed, and she looked at her husband's hand on another woman's back, and she understood, with a terrible crystalline certainty, that she had not been wrong about any of it. She left the gala without speaking to him. She texted Marcus for the car. She rode home. She relieved the sitter, nursed Micah, put him down in the bassinet. She stood at the penthouse windows looking out at the city. She did not cry. Not because she wasn't in pain. The pain was extraordinary, the kind that operates below sound, but because something had shifted inside her. Something had gone from soft to hard, from hopeful to clear. She had a choice to make. She could confront him and let him explain and let him apologize, and let this become the kind of marriage where forgiveness is given so many times it stops meaning anything. Or she could get quiet. She chose quiet. She went to bed before Lucian came home. When he arrived, she heard him at 1:40 a.m. She'd been lying awake staring at the ceiling. He moved through the bedroom carefully, the way men move when they believe their wives are asleep and feel slightly guilty about it. She kept her breathing slow and even. She was already planning. She didn't know yet what was on the laptop. She didn't know yet about the custody strategy folder or the attorney's emails or the financial architecture he'd been quietly building around her. That discovery was still weeks away. What she knew, lying there in the dark while her husband undressed on the other side of the room, was this. The man she had married had made a very serious mistake. He had spent 2 years teaching her that she needed him. But Nia Bennett had grown up in a Baltimore house where the heat went out in January. She knew exactly how to survive in the cold. The morning after the gala, Nia made coffee. That was it. That was the whole of her external reaction. She stood at the kitchen counter in her nursing bra and a pair of old scrub pants, and she made coffee with the same deliberate attention she gave to everything. Measuring the grounds, watching the water level, wiping the counter where she'd spilled 3 drops. Lucian came out of the bedroom at 8:15, showered and dressed, and she handed him a cup without being asked. He looked at her over the rim. "You were asleep when I got home." "I was tired." "You okay?" "I'm always tired, Lucian. I have a 10-week-old. He nodded, like that settled something, drank half the coffee, and told her he had meetings until 7. She said okay. He kissed her on the top of her head. Not her mouth. Her head, the way you kiss a child or an elderly relative. And then he was gone. and Nia stood in the kitchen listening to the elevator close and felt the silence of the penthouse press against her from every direction. Micah started crying from the nursery. She went to him. She picked him up and held him against her chest and stood at the window, rocking slightly, looking out at the city 22 floors below. October had arrived and the trees in the park had gone the color of fire. It was genuinely beautiful. She registered it the way you register beauty when you're too exhausted and too frightened to fully feel it, at a distance, like looking at a painting behind glass. Okay, she said quietly, to Micah, or to herself, or to both of them. Okay. She had a plan forming. It wasn't a complete plan yet. It was more like the skeleton of one, the bare architecture. She needed money she controlled. She needed to understand what she'd signed. She needed someone she could trust with the truth. And she needed to find that someone without Lucian knowing she was looking. The money problem was the most immediate. She still had her nursing license. She still had her DEA credentials. She had been on a voluntary leave of absence from the hospital since her 7th month of pregnancy, which had been her choice. Lucian hadn't asked her to stop working. He'd simply made it financially unnecessary, and she had let exhaustion and comfort make the decision for her. Another thing she would not forgive herself for easily. She called the hospital the following Tuesday, when Micah was with their part-time sitter, a quiet Jamaican woman named Evelyn, who smelled of lavender and handled the baby with the easy confidence of someone who had raised children of her own. She asked about her leave status. Her supervisor, a solid woman named Karen, who'd worked the trauma unit for 19 years and trusted Nia without reservation, told her she could return to per diem shifts as soon as she was ready. No questions. No ceremony. "I'm ready," Nia said. There was a small pause on the line. "Everything all right?" "I'm just ready to work again," Karen understood. Karen had been divorced twice. She said, "I'll put you on the schedule for next week." Nia didn't tell Lucian about the shifts immediately. She told him 2 days before her first one, casually, during dinner, in the same neutral tone she used to report Micah's pediatrician appointments. He put down his fork. "You're going back?" "A few shifts a week. Evelyn can cover." "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to. I want to." He looked at her for a moment. She held the look without filling it. "Fine," he said, and picked up his fork again. But the word had a texture to it. Fine, the way concrete is fine, solid and gray and not at all soft. She started working the following Thursday. Standing in the trauma bay again felt like putting on a coat she'd left on a hook for too long. Familiar in its weight, slightly strange in its fit. But within 20 minutes of her first patient, the strangeness dissolved, and what remained was the thing she'd been missing without allowing herself to name it: competence. Undeniable, inarguable, belonging to no one but her competence. Nobody in that unit existed because of Lucian Vescari. Nobody there called her Mrs. Vescari or deferred to her because of whose wife she was. They called her Nia, and they handed her charts, and they trusted her judgment. She worked 12 hours. She drove herself home. She picked up Micah from Evelyn, nursed him, put him to sleep. She felt, for the first time in months, like a person. Then November came, and with it the first real confrontation. It started small. They usually do. Lucian came home on a Wednesday to find Nia on the phone with a woman named Andrea, a college friend from Baltimore who'd become a financial advisor. They weren't speaking about anything that should have triggered anything. They were talking about opening an individual savings account, Nia's own, separate from the household account. And Lucian walked in on the tail end of the sentence. He waited until the call ended. "What was that?" "Andrea Moss, we went to school together." "What were you opening?" "A savings account." The silence that followed had a particular quality. Not angry. Not yet. Evaluating. "Why?" he asked. "Because I'm earning my own money again, and I want somewhere to put it that's mine." He tilted his head very slightly. "Everything I have is yours." "That's not the same thing. Nia, I'm not asking for permission, Lucian. I'm telling you what I'm doing." The temperature in the room didn't change. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. That was one of the things that made him genuinely frightening, the absence of the kind of heat that would tell you where the danger was. He was cold when he was serious and warm when he wasn't, and the warmth was less reliable than the cold. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer me honestly." "I always answer you honestly." "Are you unhappy with how I provide for this family?" She wanted to laugh. The absurdity of the question, provide for this family. While she stood there having worked a 12-hour trauma shift and driven home alone and fed and bathed their son and scheduled his 4-month checkup and arranged the dry cleaning and rescheduled the plumber. The audacity of it actually made her throat tighten. "I'm not having this conversation right now," she said. "I think we need to. I think Micah needs to be bathed and put down, and I've been on my feet for 12 hours. So no, not right now." She walked past him. He let her go. But she felt his attention follow her down the hall like something with weight. The savings account was opened the following Monday. She deposited her first paycheck into it and felt something inside her exhale. December was brutal in a different way. Lucian was gone more. Not late. Gone. Overnight once, then twice. He gave explanations that were technically plausible, sir. A problem with a shipment through his New Jersey warehouse operation. A meeting in Philadelphia that ran long and he'd stayed at the hotel rather than drive back. She didn't argue. She didn't ask twice. She was saving her questions for when they would matter. She also started noticing other things, smaller things. The way he angled his phone away from her when a text came in. The way certain calls sent him out of rooms. The slight recalibration of his attention when she walked in unexpectedly. Not guilt, exactly, but awareness. The awareness of a man who has decided that certain parts of his life are not available to his wife. She recognized Valentina Rourke by accident. It was a Sunday in early December, and she was at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital between shifts, sitting at a corner table with a flat white and a medical journal she was only half reading. The door opened and 2 women came in. One she didn't know, and one she recognized from the gala. The blonde in burgundy, standing in ordinary daylight now, still striking, wearing a cashmere coat and looking at her phone with the distracted ease of someone whose life moves smoothly. Nia watched her order. She watched her sit down. She noted the name, Valentina, because the woman answered her phone in the middle of the coffee shop and said it in a tone that assumed the world would arrange itself around her comfort. She watched her face when she was talking, something in the jaw, something proprietary. Nia paid for her coffee and left. In the car, she sat for 3 full minutes without starting the engine. That's who she is, she thought. That's the name that goes with the hand on the back. She started the engine. She drove back to the hospital and finished her shift. She was precise and competent, and her hands never shook. Micah was 4.5 months old. She came home that night and he was awake, lying in the bouncy chair Evelyn had set up in the living room, batting at the mobile with uncoordinated baby fury. Nia sat down on the floor next to him and let him grab her finger, and she watched his face, so serious, so concentrated on the enormous task of existing, and something in her went very quiet. She was going to have to do this right, not fast, not emotional, right. The following week, she remembered Jonah Kessler. She'd thought of him occasionally over the years in the distracted way you think of people who pass through a critical moment with you and then moved on. He'd been a patient. Not her patient, technically. He'd come through triage and she'd covered when the assigned nurse was swamped. He'd been brought in following a car accident, conscious but badly rattled, with a broken radius and a gash along his hairline that had bled dramatically. He'd been calm, calmer than most. She'd asked him once, while she was cleaning the wound, how he could be so collected, and he'd said, "Because panicking doesn't change the outcome. Thinking does." She'd found out later he was an attorney. Family law and civil litigation primarily. She found his office through a web search on her phone during a break at the hospital, using cellular data so the search wouldn't pass through their home network. His firm was in Midtown. The website was appropriately understated, the kind of professional minimalism that communicated confidence rather than desperation for clients. She called from the hospital parking garage. His assistant asked her name. She said Nia Bennett, her maiden name, not Vescari, which she hadn't used professionally in 2 years. The assistant put her on hold. 30 seconds later, Jonah Kessler's actual voice came through the line. "Nia Bennett, the nurse. You remember? You're hard to forget. You told me the scar was going to be visible and then apologized for it like it was your fault. I thought that was an interesting thing to feel responsible for." A pause. "What can I do for you?" "I need to talk to an attorney." A beat. "How serious?" She looked out the garage window at the gray December sky. "Serious enough that I'm calling from a hospital parking garage on my lunch break." Another pause, longer this time. "When can you come in?" She met with him 4 days later during a shift when Evelyn was with Micah. She took a cab rather than using the car from Lucian's LLC. She wore her work clothes, scrubs and a down jacket, because she didn't want to walk into a law office looking like Lucian Vescari's wife. She wanted to walk in looking like herself. Jonah Kessler was 51 now, slightly heavier than she remembered, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the kind of steady, unimpressible quality that good attorneys develop over decades of being lied to and surprised in equal measure. He shook her hand and poured her water and didn't waste time. "Start from the beginning," he said. She did. She talked for 40 minutes. She told him about the accounts, the documents she'd signed without reading, the house title, the car, the credit card with its carefully managed limit. She told him about the gala and the hand on the back. She told him about the overnight absences and the way questions were deflected rather than answered. She did not cry. She had decided before she walked in that she would not cry, not because emotion was wrong, but because she needed him to see her clearly, and grief has a way of blurring the image. When she finished, Jonah took off his glasses and set them on the desk. "You said you signed documents without reading them." "Yes." "How many?" "At least 3 that I can identify, possibly more." "Do you know what was in them?" "Not entirely. That's part of the problem." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does your husband do, specifically?" She held his gaze. "What have you heard about Lucian Vescari?" His expression didn't change. "I've heard enough." "Then you know that what he does specifically isn't something I can give you a clean answer to. He has legitimate businesses, real estate, logistics, a couple of hospitality holdings, and then there's the rest of it." "And are you involved in the rest of it?" "No." "Are you certain?" She thought about the documents she hadn't read, the accounts she didn't fully understand, the money that moved through their household in ways she'd stopped trying to track. "I'm not certain of anything," she said honestly. "That's why I'm here." Jonah nodded slowly. "Okay, here's what I'm going to tell you, and I need you to hear all of it." He leaned forward. "If you go at this man directly, if you confront him, if you let him know you're planning to leave, if you do anything that signals your intention before you have the full picture, you will lose. Not because you're wrong, because he has resources you don't yet have access to, and he will use every single one of them to protect himself and his assets, which includes your son." The word landed. "Your son." She kept her face neutral, her nursing face. "What do I do?" "You become invisible. You stay exactly where you are, and you do not change anything he can see. Meanwhile, you gather everything you can get your hands on: financial records, communications, documents, anything that shows you what you actually signed, what's actually in your name, and who he really is. And if I find things that are worse than what I already know," he met her eyes steadily, "then you bring them to me and we deal with them. But you do not deal with them alone. Do you understand?" "Yes." "I mean it, Nia. Whatever you find, you don't react. You document and you call me." She drove back to the hospital and worked the remaining 4 hours of her shift. She intubated a 37-year-old man whose heart had stopped in a restaurant. She held a teenage girl's hand while they waited for her parents. She charted 6 patients and reviewed discharge instructions for 2 more. She drove home at midnight. She walked past the bassinet where Micah was sleeping, his chest rising and falling with that particular newborn rhythm she'd spent weeks learning. And she went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink in the dark. The discovery came 3 weeks later, and it didn't arrive the way she might have imagined. No dramatic confrontation, no moment of high revelation. It came the way most terrible things come, quietly, when you are simply doing something ordinary. Lucian had left his laptop on the kitchen island. He did this sometimes. He had 3 devices and occasionally left one while migrating to another, the way powerful men are careless with things they believe are sufficiently protected. The screen was dark, but when she moved it to plug in the charger, her hand caught the trackpad. The screen woke up. She almost looked away. She had been practicing these past weeks, not looking at things that weren't hers. It was part of what Jonah had called disciplined patience. But the document was already open, and the subject line at the top of the email chain she was looking at stopped her before she could stop herself. R.E. Vescari. Dissolution Strategy. Custody Framework. Confidential. She sat down very slowly. Her eyes moved over the screen with the same precision she used to read a patient chart when the numbers were alarming. systematic, not missing anything. The email chain involved three parties: Lucian, a man named Gerard Loomis, who was identified in his signature as a senior partner at a firm Nia had never heard of, and Hargrove, the thin, dry man who'd asked her to sign documents she hadn't read. The chain was 14 emails long. It had been active for 6 months. The oldest email in the thread predated Micah's birth by 11 weeks. She read all 14. By the time she finished, her hands were flat on the table on either side of the laptop, and she was breathing very deliberately through her nose. The way she breathed in the trauma bay when the situation was critical, and she could not afford to lose herself inside it. The strategy was elegant, in the particular ugly way that legal cruelty can be elegant. The documents she'd signed without reading had transferred certain assets and created certain financial dependencies that would, in a divorce proceeding, make her appear to have willingly accepted a specific financial arrangement. The marital home, the penthouse, would revert entirely to Lucian under the terms of one of those documents. The household account and its credit card would be characterized as the agreed-upon support structure, evidence that Nia had been well provided for rather than controlled. And then there was the custody section. Loomis had written it, and Lucian had responded with 2 words: "This works." The strategy centered on Nia's postpartum period, her difficulty sleeping, her emotional state in the weeks after Micah's birth. There were references in the emails to documented observations, she didn't know yet who had documented them or how, that would be presented as evidence of instability. There was language about Nia's erratic return to work and the questionable judgment involved in a new mother resuming trauma nursing shifts. The goal, written in Loomis's careful clinical language, was primary physical and legal custody for Lucian, with Nia receiving standard supervised visitation pending psychological evaluation. Supervised visitation of her own son. She sat at that table for 11 minutes. She knew because she was watching the microwave clock. She needed something to watch, something concrete and external that kept her inside herself. Then she closed the laptop. She put it back exactly where it had been. She went to the nursery. She stood over Micah's bassinet and looked at him. 4.5 months old, sleeping on his back with his arms flung out wide like someone who had just decided to trust the whole world. Her jaw tightened until it ached. She went to the bedroom, got into bed, and lay still until she heard Lucian come in at 2:15. She heard him check the nursery. She heard him come into the bedroom. She heard him undress in the dark and get into bed beside her. She lay perfectly still. Her eyes were open in the darkness. She thought about Jonah's voice. You do not deal with them alone. She was going to need more than a savings account and a nursing license. She was going to need to become someone Lucian Vescari had already decided she wasn't. The next morning, she waited until he left. Then she went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat down at the table with her own laptop. Her personal device, separate from anything connected to his network, something she'd thought to purchase 3 weeks ago and had been keeping in her locker at the hospital. She opened a new document. At the top, she typed a single word: evidence. And she began to write down everything she remembered from those 14 emails in as much detail as she could reconstruct, while it was still fresh and before the fear could override the precision. She filled 4 pages. Then she called Jonah from the hospital parking garage. He answered on the second ring. I found something, she said. He was quiet for 1 second. How bad? She looked out at the gray January sky. Micah was 5 months old. The custody strategy folder had been active for 6 months. Lucian had begun planning to take her son before Micah had even been born. They were planning to use my postpartum period against me, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. They documented things. I don't know who or how much. They want supervised visitation for me, of my own child. She heard Jonah exhale slowly through his nose. How long ago was the last email in the chain? 4 days. Nia. His voice was careful and precise. Listen to me very carefully. He is moving. This is not theoretical anymore. He is close to filing. The cold came in from somewhere. How close? Close enough that we need to talk today. Can you come in? She looked at the clock on the dashboard. I have a shift at 2. Before 2. Yes. Come now. She put the car in drive. And something inside her, some last remaining part that had still been hoping she was wrong, that she'd misread it, That the man she'd married at 32 in a restaurant on the Upper East Side with 60 people watching and white peonies on the tables was not actually capable of this. That part went quiet, not broken, not destroyed. Quiet in the way that a nurse goes quiet before she makes a decision that cannot be reversed. When the patient is crashing and the options have narrowed and there is exactly one move left and she knows what it is and she is going to do it and she is not going to hesitate. She drove. Jonah's office was on the 31st floor of a building on Lexington Avenue that smelled of recycled air and old ambition. Nia had been there twice before, once for the initial consultation, once to drop off the reconstructed notes she'd typed after reading Lucian's emails. Both times she'd arrived feeling like someone carrying something fragile across a long distance. This time she arrived feeling different, not stronger, exactly. More like someone who had already dropped the fragile thing and was now just walking through the wreckage trying to figure out what was still usable. Jonah's assistant waved her through without making her wait. He was standing when she came in, which told her something. Jonah Kessler was the kind of man who sat down for routine meetings and stood up for the ones that required full attention. He had his reading glasses on, not pushed up on his forehead the way they usually were, but actually on his face, which meant he'd been reading something recently and hadn't bothered to take them off. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said. "From the beginning. Don't summarize. Reconstruct." She did. She walked him through all 14 emails the way she'd walk a medical student through a complex case, sequentially, without editorializing, noting what she was certain of and flagging what she was reconstructing from memory. It took 22 minutes. Jonah listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He didn't interrupt because he was assembling. An interruption broke the assembly. When she finished, he took his glasses off. "The documents you signed," he said, "the ones Hargrove presented." "Yes." "I need you to think carefully. Was Lucian present in the room for all of them?" "2 out of 3 that I remember. The third one, Hargrove brought it to the penthouse while Lucian was traveling. He said it was time-sensitive." Jonah's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "And Lucian called you about it?" "He texted. He said it was routine and to go ahead and sign." "Do you still have that text?" She pulled out her phone. She had screenshot everything she could think of over the past 3 weeks, not knowing exactly what would matter, only knowing that the principle of document everything was the closest thing to solid ground she had. She found the text thread, found the message, turned the screen toward him. He looked at it for 4 seconds. "I need you to send that to my secure email right now." She did. He set down his glasses and looked at her directly. "The document Hargrove brought. I believe it may contain a clause waiving your right to contest asset division under certain conditions. If I'm right, it would explain why they felt confident enough to start the custody strategy while you were still pregnant. They believed they had already neutralized your financial position." The word neutralize sat in the air between them. "Can it be challenged?" she asked. "Potentially. If we can demonstrate coercion, misrepresentation, or that you signed without adequate opportunity to seek independent counsel. Yes. It's not guaranteed, but it's workable." He paused. "What concerns me more right now is the documentation they claim to have, the observed behaviors from your postpartum period. Do you have any idea who they're sourcing that from?" She'd been thinking about this since she'd driven away from the penthouse, running through the months after Micah's birth, who had been in the apartment, who had access, who Lucian might have positioned in a way she hadn't noticed. "Evelyn," she said slowly. "Our sitter. Tell me about her." "She's been with us since Micah came home from the hospital. Lucian found her, not through an agency I chose, through someone his property manager recommended." She stopped. "I never thought about who recommended her. Has she ever asked you unusual questions about your emotional state, your sleep, your medications?" Nia went very still. She thought about December. About a Tuesday afternoon when she'd come home from a shift and sat at the kitchen table and cried, not dramatically, not a breakdown, just the quiet, functional crying of a woman who had been holding herself together for too long and briefly stopped. Evelyn had been in the apartment. She'd brought Nia a glass of water and asked, in her careful way, whether Nia was feeling overwhelmed, whether she'd spoken to a doctor about how she was feeling, whether she was sleeping. At the time, it had felt like kindness. "She asked me about a doctor once," Nia said. About whether I was seeing anyone for postpartum support. Jonah was quiet. She kept a journal, Nia said, and as she said it, she knew it was true. She was assembling the pieces as she spoke them. She had a little notebook. I thought it was for Micah's schedule, feed times, nap times. I never looked at it closely. Jonah leaned back in his chair, not relaxing, thinking. We have to assume they have documented observations from someone inside your household going back several months. We have to assume it's been compiled in a way that will be admissible, or at least usable as leverage. He looked at her. This changes your timeline. How much? I need you to listen to me and not react. Can you do that? Yes, based on the email chain you described, specifically the activity level and the language Loomis used in the most recent communication. I believe Lucian intends to file within the next 2 to 4 weeks. The room didn't change. The light through the windows was the same flat January gray. The sound of the building's ventilation system continued at its low, consistent hum. None of it changed. Nia breathed through her nose. 2 to 4 weeks, she repeated. If he files first, he controls the initial narrative. He walks into court with a prepackaged story about an unstable wife, a concerned and capable husband, and documented evidence from someone who lived in your home. We would be responding to his version of events rather than presenting ours. So I need to move first. You need to be ready to move first. There's a difference. He stood up and went to the window. Not dramatically, just the movement of a man who thought better standing. Before we file anything, I need 3 things. I need the financial documentation, every account, every transaction you can access, every asset you know of. I need the original copies or photographs of every document you signed. And I need whatever else is on that laptop or any other device you can access without alerting him. The laptop is password protected. Can you get into it? I got into it once because he left it open. Then we need another window. He turned from the glass. Is there anything else? Any other device? Any paper files? Anything physical that you've seen and not yet examined? She thought about the study. Lucian's private office at the far end of the penthouse, which he kept locked when he was away, and which she'd never had reason to go into, or rather, had never felt entitled to go into, which was a distinction she was only now understanding fully. His study, she said. I don't have a key. Is there a spare anywhere in the apartment? I don't know. I've never looked. Look. She nodded. Nia. He waited until she met his eyes. I need you to understand what I'm about to say with complete clarity. What you're doing, collecting this information inside an active household with a man who has connections to organized crime, carries risk. Real risk. Not legal risk. Personal risk. If he discovers what you're doing before we're ready, the situation escalates in ways I cannot control from this office. He held her gaze. Is there anyone outside New York you trust? Completely. She thought immediately of her sister, Dana, in Philadelphia, 4 years younger, a high school vice principal, married with 2 kids. The most organized and most unflappable person Nia had ever known personally. My sister. Is she aware of any of this? No. Can you call her today, without using your home phone or your household Wi-Fi? Yes. Tell her enough that if something happens quickly, she knows where to come and what to do. Don't tell her details over the phone, just enough. He paused. And I need you to think seriously about where you would go, with Micah, if you needed to leave in under 12 hours. Not a hotel, not somewhere Lucian would think of in the first 48 hours. She was already doing the calculation. Dana's house. Philadelphia is workable. We'd need to file immediately in Pennsylvania to establish jurisdiction, but it's workable. He came back to the desk. How are you right now, truthfully? I'm scared, she said, but I'm not panicking. He nodded, once. Good. Don't panic. Panic is the one thing we can't use. She called Dana from the garage again 20 minutes later. Dana answered on the first ring because Dana always answered on the first ring. It was a quality Nia had taken for granted her entire life, and now felt like something close to life-saving. Hey, I need you to listen and not ask questions until I'm done. Can you do that? A short pause. Dana had 3 years of experience managing teenagers. She could read urgency. Yes. Nia talked for 8 minutes. She was careful. No specifics, no names of attorneys, no details about what she'd found. Just the shape of it. My marriage is ending badly and I may need to move fast, and I need to know that you're there." When she finished, Dana was quiet for 3 seconds. "You and Micah come to me and Marcus won't even find the spare room," she said. Marcus was Dana's husband. "You know that." "I know. How long have you been sitting on this?" "Weeks." "Nia," Dana's voice dropped. "Why didn't you call me?" "Because I needed to have a plan before I told anyone. Otherwise, I'd just be frightened out loud, and that doesn't help anything." Another pause. "That's the most you thing you've ever said." Despite everything, Nia almost laughed. "Almost. I'll call when I know more. Don't tell Marcus the specifics yet." "Okay, but Nia, I'm okay. I promise." She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she drove back to the hospital and finished her shift, and she was precise all the way through it. And when she got home that night, Micah reached up and grabbed her nose with both hands, and she sat on the nursery floor with him for an hour, just existing in the specific warmth of that, letting it be enough for tonight. Lucian came home at 11:30. He seemed distracted. Not distant the way he usually was, distracted in a particular way, like a man recalculating something. He looked at her twice during the few minutes they overlapped in the kitchen, both times with a quality of attention she couldn't fully categorize. "You look tired," he said. "Long shift. You're working too much." "I'm fine." He looked at her a third time before he went to bed, and this one was different, slower, more deliberate, the look of a man who is checking something against a mental template and finding the result inconclusive. She felt it on her skin the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. She stayed in this kitchen another 20 minutes after he went down the hall. Then she went to the hallway table drawer, the catch-all drawer that every household has, the place where spare batteries and takeout menus and forgotten receipts accumulate. And she began very methodically to go through it. She found the key on her third pass through the drawer contents, taped to the inside of the back panel with a strip of electrical tape that had been there long enough to yellow. A small key, plain, the kind that fits a basic lock rather than anything serious. The kind of key a man keeps in a drawer because he is not worried about his wife looking. She held it in her palm for a moment. Then she put it back. Exactly where it was, tape and all, not yet. The call came on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later, and it came from a number she didn't recognize, which she almost didn't answer because she was nursing Micah and her phone was across the room. She almost let it go to voicemail. She didn't. She answered it with Micah still in her arms, shifting him to her left side to free her right hand. "Is this Nia Vescari?" The voice was female. "Careful." "Who is this?" "My name is Carla Diaz. I'm an investigator with the Financial Crimes Unit of the New York District Attorney's Office. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience about accounts held in your name." The world got very quiet. Micah made a small sound. She adjusted him automatically, her body operating independently of whatever her mind was doing, which was something close to freefall. "Accounts in my name," she said. Her voice came out flat and professional. Trauma Bay flat. "Yes, ma'am. We've identified several transactions that we believe you may not have been aware of. We'd like to give you an opportunity to speak with us before this goes further." Before this goes further. She understood what that meant. She had spent enough time around Lucian's world to understand that when law enforcement said "before this goes further," they meant before we decide whether you're a suspect or a witness. "I'll need to speak with my attorney before I schedule anything," she said. "Of course. We'd appreciate a call back within... I'll have him contact your office today." She hung up. She sat very still with Micah against her chest and her phone in her hand, and she thought about the documents she'd signed without reading and the accounts she didn't fully understand, and the money that had moved through their household in ways she'd stopped trying to track. She thought about what she'd said to Jonah. "I'm not certain of anything." Someone, Lucian, or people working for Lucian, or both, had moved money through accounts connected to her identity. Her name was on transactions she had never made, which meant that the man who had built a legal strategy to take her son was also building, simultaneously, a financial exposure that could be used against her if she became a liability. She wasn't just a wife he was planning to discard. She was a contingency. She called Jonah with Micah still in her arms. He answered in 2 rings. She told him about the call in 30 seconds, exactly as it had happened. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough to be significant. "When did this call come in?" he asked. 4 minutes ago." She identified herself as Financial Crimes? "Yes." "Full name?" "Carla Diaz." She heard him write it down. Okay, do not call that number back. Do not speak to anyone from that office without me present. Forward me the caller ID number right now. He paused. And Nia, this changes things significantly. How significantly? The DA's office doesn't call wives at home to offer them opportunities to speak unless they already have something. They have transactions. They have your name on them. The question is whether they believe you authorized those transactions or whether they believe you're a victim of someone who used your identity. Another pause. We need to know which direction they're leaning before we make any move. How do we find that out? I make a call, today. She heard him stand up from his desk, the subtle shift in sound. But Nia, I need you to hear this. If they've been building a case that includes accounts in your name, and if Lucian's attorneys know about this investigation, which they likely do, then the custody filing isn't just about custody anymore. He may be trying to move against you on both fronts simultaneously. Destabilize your legal standing while you're also being looked at by the DA. She processed this. 2 fronts, simultaneously. He's trying to corner me, she said. Yes. Make me choose between defending myself against the DA and defending myself in family court. Yes. And both of those fights require resources, financial and legal, that he controls the access to because of the documents you signed. She looked at Micah. He had fallen asleep against her chest, his mouth slightly open, his small fist curled against her collarbone. 5.5 months old, completely unaware of any of it. What do I do right now? She asked. Today, this hour. Right now, you go through every record you have access to, bank statements, tax documents, anything with your name on it that you can photograph or copy, and you get it to me before end of day. And tonight, when Lucian is home, you behave exactly as you always do. You do not ask him about accounts. You do not reference the call. You give him nothing. And the study? A pause. The study, Jonah said carefully, becomes urgent. That night, Lucian came home at 9. He ate the dinner she'd kept warm without commenting on it. He checked his phone 3 times during the meal. He poured himself a drink, just one, which was unusual. Lucian typically had 2, and went to his study and closed the door. She heard the lock click. She washed the dishes. She fed Micah his last bottle of the evening. She put him down. She listened to the ambient sounds of the penthouse. The distant sound of Lucian's voice through the study door, one short call, words indistinct. The sound of his chair, the sound of silence after. He came out at 11. I'm going to be in Chicago Friday through Sunday, he said. She looked at him over the top of her book. Business? There's a property deal that needs in-person attention. She nodded and returned to her book. He stood there for a moment. She could feel it, his presence in the room, the particular quality of his attention. Then he went to bed. She gave him 40 minutes. Then she got up. She went to the hallway drawer. She retrieved the taped key. She walked to the study. The key fit. The study was orderly in the way of a man who kept his most important things in his mind and used physical files as backup. A desk, a filing cabinet, shelves of binders. A secondary laptop, closed. She didn't touch the laptop. She went to the filing cabinet, which was unlocked. Why lock a cabinet inside a locked room? And she opened the top drawer. The files were labeled in a system she didn't recognize at first. Short codes, letters and numbers. She photographed the labels of every hanging file before she touched any of them. Then she opened the ones whose codes seemed financial. She found 4 accounts she had never seen before. All of them listed her name as a secondary holder. All of them showed transaction histories she had never participated in. The numbers were not small. The dates went back further than their marriage. Her hand stayed completely steady while she photographed every page. She found the custody folder last. It was a physical file, not just digital. 40 pages of printed emails, a timeline, a document that appeared to be a draft declaration written in someone else's voice describing Nia's behavior in clinical, damning language that she recognized as coming from Evelyn's observations. She photographed all 40 pages. She put everything back, exactly as it had been. She relocked the study door. She returned the key to the drawer and reapplied the electrical tape as precisely as she could in the dark hallway at midnight. Then she went to the bathroom, turned on the shower, and sat on the edge of the tub. She had been wrong about one thing. She had believed she was in a difficult marriage with a dangerous man who had stopped loving her. That was the story she'd been telling herself, a story with recognizable edges and a certain kind of grief attached to it. The truth was bigger and uglier than that. She was in a trap that had been designed before she could see the walls. Lucian had not stopped loving her. He had never intended to build a life with her. He had built a structure around her and called it a life, and the structure was designed to benefit him whether she stayed or left. If she stayed, she remained dependent and controllable. If she left exposed. Her name attached to his money, his crimes, his decisions, all of it available to be used against her in a courtroom or a DA's office, or both. She was not a wife. She was a position, a legal and financial position he had constructed with her identity. The shower ran hot, and she sat on the edge of the tub, and she let herself have exactly 4 minutes of feeling the full size of it, the betrayal, the fear, the rage that sat beneath both of them like a floor, solid and absolute. 4 minutes. Then she stood up. She turned off the shower. She dried her face. She went to the bedroom and lay down next to the man who had done all of this, and she regulated her breathing, and she thought about what Jonah had said about panicking. Panic is the one thing we can't use. She was done being afraid of Lucian Vescari. Fear had been the appropriate response when she didn't know the shape of what she was dealing with. Now she knew the shape. And knowing the shape of a thing, in her experience, was always the beginning of knowing how to break it. She had the photographs. She had the account numbers. She had 40 pages of his custody strategy in her phone. She had a lawyer who believed her and a sister in Philadelphia with a spare room and a savings account that was only hers and a nursing license nobody could revoke, and a mind that had been trained in the specific discipline of functioning clearly inside catastrophe. He had used her name to build something criminal, and he was going to use her child to control her, and he had positioned an investigator to watch her inside her own home. And he had, systematically and with full deliberation, made her believe for 2 years that she needed him to survive. She was about to show him what she looked like when she decided to survive without him. But she needed one more thing before she could move. One piece she didn't yet have. Because the photographs and the accounts and the emails were evidence of what Lucian had done to her. And that mattered enormously. It was the foundation of everything. But what she needed now was evidence of what Lucian had done that had nothing to do with her. The kind of evidence that didn't just end a marriage, the kind that ended an empire. And she was almost certain she knew where to find it, because in 40 pages of documents, in 4 accounts full of transactions, in a custody strategy built on the premise that Nia Vescari was a woman too fragile to raise her own son. In all of it, there was one name that appeared more than any other. Not Loomis, not Hargrove, not Valentina Rourke. A name she didn't recognize yet. A name that appeared in the margins of the financial documents and in the CC line of 2 of the emails, and on a handwritten note in the back of the custody folder that said only, "Confirm with R before filing. He needs to sign off." R. She lay in the dark next to Lucian Vescari, and she thought about the letter R, and she understood, with the particular clarity of a person who has nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for, that whoever R was, whoever needed to sign off, was the key that unlocked something much larger than a divorce. And Lucian, in his absolute certainty that she was too frightened and too dependent and too exhausted to ever become dangerous, had left the door to his study unlocked inside a room he thought only he could enter. He had made, without knowing it, the last mistake he would ever make with her. She found R on a Thursday. It took her 11 days after the night in the study, 11 days of working her hospital shifts and coming home and being exactly the wife Lucian expected to see, quiet, present, slightly tired, asking no questions he didn't invite, while she moved through everything she'd photographed with the methodical patience of someone cataloging evidence in a case that had no room for error. She went through the account documents first. 4 accounts, all with her name listed as secondary holder, all showing transaction histories that spanned the past 3 years. The money moved in patterns she recognized from her limited understanding of how Lucian's legitimate businesses operated: regular deposits, regular transfers, amounts that were large enough to matter but small enough, individually, to avoid certain automatic flags. She wasn't a forensic accountant. She didn't need to be. She needed to understand enough to explain it to someone who was. She sent the photographs to Jonah in 3 encrypted batches, the way he'd shown her, using the burner email account he'd set up for their communication. His response came back within 2 hours. This is significant. Do not discuss with anyone else. She was already ahead of him on that. The name in the margins of the financial documents, the one that appeared with a frequency she'd started to track, was written in two forms, sometimes as a full surname, Resnick, sometimes just R, the way you write a name when you've written it so many times it's become shorthand even to yourself. She searched the name through the hospital's public Wi-Fi on her lunch break, using a browser she'd cleared from her personal phone. The search returned the kind of results that told her immediately this was not a minor figure. News articles going back 12 years, references in financial press. The name attached to a private equity group operating out of a midtown address. A man who appeared in photographs at the edges of important rooms without ever being at the center of them. Years old, absolutely no criminal record, board member of 3 legitimate organizations. The kind of man who existed adjacent to power rather than instimate it, which was its own specific kind of power. She looked at his photograph for a long time. Then she sent the name to Jonah. His response came back in 40 minutes this time, and it was 2 sentences. I know who this is. Call me from the garage. She called from the garage. Raymond Resnick, Jonah said, without preamble, has been under federal investigation for financial crimes for approximately 18 months. Money laundering, specifically, structured transactions designed to move cash from illegal sources through a series of legitimate-appearing investment vehicles. He paused. The accounts in your name appear to be part of that network. The fluorescent light in the parking garage buzzed slightly above her head. So Lucian was funneling money for Resnick, she said, or with him. The relationship isn't entirely clear from what you've found, but it doesn't need to be clear to us. It needs to be clear to the people who are already investigating it. Another pause, deliberate. Nia, the DA's office calling you. This isn't a coincidence. They are close to something, and the accounts in your name are part of their picture. The question is whether Lucian put your name on those accounts to give himself cover, or whether Resnick required a secondary holder and Lucian used you without telling you. Does the distinction matter legally? For you? Enormously. For Lucian? Not at all. She stared at the concrete wall of the parking garage. What do I do with this? The federal investigation changes our strategy. If we go into family court while a federal case is building around the same asset structure, everything becomes complicated and slow. But if we cooperate with the right people, with the right information, at the right moment, he stopped. I need to make some calls, not today. I need to verify some things about the federal case and about where the DA fits into it. But Nia, I need you to hear me. What you found in that study is not just evidence for a divorce proceeding. It is potentially significant evidence in a federal criminal investigation. Which means the moment Lucian realizes you have it, your personal safety becomes a serious concern. She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since she'd relocked the study door and gone back to bed. How long do you need? She asked. A week, maybe 10 days. He comes back from Chicago Sunday. I know. Can you hold for 10 days after Sunday? She thought about Evelyn with her little notebook. She thought about the DA investigator's voice on the phone. She thought about Lucian's eyes on her across the kitchen, that slow, measuring look. Yes, she said. She wasn't sure it was true, but she said it anyway because the alternative was panic, and panic was the one thing they couldn't use. Sunday came. Lucian returned from Chicago in a taxi rather than a car service, which was unusual. He came through the door at 6 in the evening looking like a man who had not slept well. A slight graying around his eyes, a tension in his jaw that he was managing but not entirely concealing. He kissed her on the top of the head. He picked up Micah, which he did sometimes, not often enough, but sometimes, and held him for approximately 3 minutes, looking at his son's face with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded Nia had seen on him in months. She watched him hold the baby. She felt nothing romantic about it. What she felt was something more clinical, the recognition that even a man capable of what Lucian had done was also capable of genuine feeling, and that those two things existing in the same body was not a contradiction, it was just the complicated ugliness of how people actually were. Good trip? She asked. Fine, complicated. Did the deal close? Working on it. He handed Micah back to her without being asked, which meant he was preoccupied. He went to his study. She heard the lock. She stood in the living room holding Micah and listening to the silence behind that door, and she understood that whatever had happened in Chicago had accelerated something. She could feel it in the apartment the way you feel a shift in temperature, subtle, in your skin before your mind catches up. She texted Jonah from the bathroom. "He's back. Something's different. How long do you need?" Jonah's reply came 4 minutes later. 6 more days. Can you give me 6? She put the phone in her pocket. She went back out and made dinner. The week that followed was the longest of her life, and she had worked a 60-hour week in a trauma bay during a heat wave, so she had context for what long felt like. Lucian was home more than usual, which was the opposite of what she'd expected and significantly more difficult to manage. She had calibrated herself to his absences, had built her information gathering and her communications with Jonah into the architecture of the hours when the penthouse was empty. His presence compressed everything. She could not use the phone freely. She could not move through the apartment with the purposeful attention she'd been allowing herself. She had to slow down and be a wife. It was the hardest thing she'd ever performed, not because the role was new, she'd been performing it for months, but because of what she knew now. Every time he handed her a coffee cup, she thought about the documents she'd signed. Every time he spoke to Micah in that low, private voice, she thought about supervised visitation pending psychological evaluation. Every time he looked at her with that assessing quality, she thought about Evelyn's notebook and the manufactured narrative being assembled to strip her of her child. She held her face perfectly still. She laughed at 2 things he said that were actually somewhat funny, because a woman who never laughs is a woman broadcasting alarm. She asked him one evening how the Chicago deal was progressing, and he said it was still complicated, and she said that sounded stressful, and he looked at her for a long moment and said, "You seem different lately." Her heart moved in her chest. "Different how?" she asked. Neutral, mildly curious. "Calmer. I've been sleeping better. Micah's starting to consolidate his nights." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded and went back to his phone. She excused herself to use the bathroom and stood over the sink and ran cold water over her wrists for 30 seconds, which was something she'd read once was useful for acute stress response and had never had occasion to test until recently. It helped. Marginally. Wednesday of that week, Evelyn didn't come. She texted at 7:15 to say she was unwell. A stomach thing. She was sorry. She hoped Nia could manage. Nia texted back that she hoped she felt better and rearranged her shift. Completely routine. Except that it happened again Thursday. And when Nia called to check on her Thursday afternoon, Evelyn answered in a voice that was not sick at all, was in fact completely normal, and told her she was feeling much better and would be in Friday. She arrived Friday morning, and Nia watched her more carefully than she ever had. The notebook was in Evelyn's bag. It came out twice during the day, once when she was recording a feed time, once while Nia was in the shower, and Micah was in the bouncy chair in the living room. When Nia came back out, Evelyn was writing in it. She put it away quickly, not guiltily, efficiently, the speed of a person who had been told to be careful. Nia said nothing. But that evening, after Evelyn left, she called Jonah. She was told to be careful, Nia said. When did she stop coming in? Wednesday and Thursday. And came back Friday? Yes. Nia. His voice was doing something careful. I spoke to someone in the federal investigation this week. I can't tell you everything yet because it's not solid, but I can tell you this. Lucian has been in contact with his attorneys every day since he came back from Chicago. Daily contact. That is not routine maintenance. That is active preparation. She was standing in the nursery. Micah was asleep. He's moving, she said. I believe so. I think something in Chicago changed his timeline. I don't know what yet. When do we move? He was quiet for a moment. I can be ready Monday, but Nia, I need the USB drive. She stopped. What USB drive? The materials from the study. The account documents, the custody folder, all of it. I have the photographs you sent, but for what I'm arranging, I need original copies or a physical drive that contains everything, formatted in a way that's usable by a third party. She thought about the documents, the photographs on her phone, the phone itself, which she kept in her locker at the hospital and never brought home. I can print them at the hospital. That works. But I also need the financial transaction records in their original format if possible. The printed account statements from the filing cabinet, not photographs of them. Is there any way to get those originals? She thought about the study, The key taped in the drawer. Lucian at home, present, watchful. He's here most evenings now. I know. I'd need him out of the apartment for at least 20 minutes. Saturday? Jonah said. He plays racquetball Saturday mornings. Does he still do that? She hadn't known he played racquetball. She filed this away without remarking on it. The fact that Jonah Kessler, who was building a legal case against Lucian Vescari, knew details about Lucian's Saturday routine was something she understood better than to examine closely right now. What time? She asked. He leaves by 8:15 typically, back by 10:30. That's enough time. Are you sure? Yes. Saturday morning. Lucian left at 8:12. She heard the elevator. She waited 4 minutes. Not because 4 minutes was necessary, but because her training had taught her that the margin between he's gone and he's actually gone was worth respecting. Then she moved. She got the key from the drawer. She unlocked the study. She went directly to the filing cabinet and pulled the drawer and found the financial files and took out every page of original documents she needed. Not the whole file, not in a way that would leave the cabinet visibly depleted, but the specific pages that corresponded to the account transaction records she'd photographed. She replaced them with blank paper from the printer on his desk, inserted in the same positions, because a man who opens a filing cabinet and feels the right amount of weight doesn't count pages unless he's suspicious, and she was not giving him a reason to be suspicious today. She also took one page from the custody folder, just one, a page she had chosen specifically because it was the one with Resnick's name in the margin, and the note in Lucian's handwriting and a date that predated Micah's birth. She relocked the study. She replaced the key. She had the documents inside a manila envelope inside a tote bag inside 9 minutes. She texted her downstairs neighbor, a retired woman named Mrs. Cho, who adored Micah and had offered 11 times to watch him, and asked if she could take him for an hour. Mrs. Cho replied with 3 exclamation points. Nia took Micah downstairs. Then she took a cab to the FedEx on 48th Street and copied everything. Then she put the originals back in the envelope and addressed it to Jonah's office. She dropped it in the FedEx drop box on the corner. It would arrive Monday morning. She was back in the penthouse with Micah by 10:04. Lucian came home at 10:38. He was slightly sweaty from the racquetball, in a better mood than he'd been all week. Physical exertion did something for him that Nia had long understood. It burned off whatever had accumulated. He came in, ruffled Micah's hair, kissed Nia on the mouth this time rather than the head, and said he was going to shower. She smiled at him. She had been sending evidence of his crimes to a federal investigation through her attorney while he played racquetball, and she was smiling at him. The thought was not satisfying in any simple way. It was too large for satisfaction. It was just a fact, and she held it the way you hold something very heavy, carefully, without dropping it, aware of exactly how much it weighed. Monday, Jonah called at 7 a.m. Package arrived, he said. Good. I'm meeting with someone from the federal case this afternoon. I need you to be available by phone from 3 o'clock forward, in case they want a statement. I'll arrange coverage for my shift. Nia. He stopped. I need to prepare you for something. What I'm about to do this afternoon, cooperating with the federal investigation, offering them what you found. This accelerates everything simultaneously. Family court, the DA inquiry, the federal case. It all starts moving at the same time. Once I walk into that room this afternoon, there's no version of this where Lucian doesn't know, within 48 to 72 hours, that you've been building a case against him. Her mouth was dry. 72 hours, she said. At most, probably less. So I have 72 hours. To do what you need to do? Yes. She already knew what she needed to do. She had known for weeks. She had the bag half-packed for 3 days, hidden in the back of her closet behind winter coats. Not a suitcase, a duffel, the kind of bag that could be picked up in 30 seconds and carried in one hand while holding a baby with the other. She had the documents copied and with Jonah. She had a savings account only she controlled. She had Dana's address memorized, not saved in her phone. She had the USB drive, the one she'd compiled over weeks, containing every photograph, every copied document, every screenshot, formatted and organized in the way Jonah had taught her. It sat in her locker at the hospital inside a sock, inside a pair of shoes, which was not sophisticated but was effective. There's something else, Jonah said. She waited. The federal investigators asked about Valentina Rourke. The name landed differently now than it had in October, standing in a ballroom watching her husband's hand on another woman's back. It had been personal then. It was structural now. What about her? She's connected to Resnick through the legitimate corporate side. She manages investor relations for one of his holding companies. She introduced Lucian and Resnick, apparently, 2 years ago. Before the marriage. Before Micah. Before all of it. She set it up, Nia said. We don't know the full picture yet. But yes, the relationship between Lucian and Valentina appears to have been as much professional as personal. She is not simply a woman he was having an affair with. She is a participant in the financial structure. Nia sat with this for a moment. She thought about the ballroom, the hand on the back, the pain she'd carried home that night, quiet and enormous. She had named it infidelity, had put it in the category of betrayal between two people, and it was that. It was absolutely that. But it was also something colder and more calculated. Valentina had not simply taken her husband. Valentina had been part of the architecture from the beginning. Does she know about the federal investigation? Nia asked. We believe she's aware. Whether she's been approached directly, we don't know yet. If she's smart, cooperate, Jonah said. Yes. And if she does, that's not bad for us. It is very bad for Lucian. The call ended. Nia sat in the hospital break room with her phone in her hands and the sound of the unit beyond the door. The specific orchestral sound of a place where people were constantly in crisis, and other people were constantly managing it. And she thought about 72 hours. She thought about the moment on Saturday when Lucian had kissed her on the mouth and she had smiled at him. She thought about Micah, who was at home with Evelyn right now, being watched and recorded by a woman Lucian had placed in their home like a piece of furniture that reported back. She thought about her mother, eating less in January so her children could eat more, never complaining loud enough for anyone to hear. She got up. She went back to her patients. She worked 7 more hours with the precision and steadiness that had always been her best quality. The quality nobody had given her, the one she'd built herself in the fluorescent years of the trauma bay, in the specific furnace of other people's emergencies. At 3:15, her phone buzzed. Jonah. Meeting went well. They want a formal statement this week. More importantly, they already had Resnick. They needed the connection to Lucian. What you found gave them that connection. She read it twice. Then, also. Vescari's attorneys filed preliminary paperwork in family court this morning. It was earlier than I expected. She read that twice, too. She called him immediately. He filed, she said. Preliminary paperwork only. It's a first step, not a full filing, but it signals the timeline has moved. Something spooked him. Yes. Chicago. That's my assumption. She was already walking toward the locker room. I need to know if he knows about the study. I don't think he does yet. If he did, the filing would have been more aggressive. This looks like preemptive positioning. He's moving first because something made him feel the need to move fast, not because he knows specifically what you have. She got to her locker. She opened it. She reached into the shoe, found the USB drive, held it in her palm. I'm not waiting 72 hours, she said. A pause. Nia. He filed this morning. He moved the timeline without telling me. I am not sitting in that apartment for 3 more days while Evelyn writes in her notebook and he makes calls in the locked study. If you leave before we're fully positioned, then we finish positioning while I'm at Dana's. You have everything. You have the originals. You have the federal connection. What do you need from me physically that requires me to be in that apartment? Silence. Nothing, Jonah admitted. Then I'm leaving tonight. Another silence, longer. I'll file for emergency custody jurisdiction in Pennsylvania first thing tomorrow morning, he said. You need to be at Dana's before he wakes up tomorrow, not after he leaves. Before he wakes up. Do you understand the difference? Yes. If he's awake when you go, he won't be. How can you be? He takes a sleep aid, has for years. He's out by midnight, and he doesn't hear anything until 6. A beat. I know things about him that he doesn't know I know. I've been paying attention for a long time. She could hear Jonah processing this. Okay, he said finally. Tonight. You have a car? I'll call a car service, not Marcus, someone he doesn't know. Call it for 2 a.m. 1:30. 1:30, he agreed. Take only what you need. Nothing that makes it obvious you planned this. Take the diaper bag, take Micah's essentials, take a bag that looks like an overnight trip. Do you hear me? Nothing that reads as I'm never coming back. She looked at the USB drive in her palm. "And the drive?" she asked. "Bring it. We'll need it for the federal statement." She closed her hand around it. "Jonah?" Her voice was steady. "When he wakes up tomorrow and finds us gone, what happens?" He didn't hesitate. "He panics. And panicking men make mistakes." She put the drive in her pocket. She went back out to the floor and finished her remaining 2 hours. She discharged a patient. She updated 2 charts. She said goodnight to Karen, who looked at her with the particular attention of a woman who had been through enough to recognize when someone is standing at the edge of something. "You all right?" Karen asked. "I will be," Nia said. She drove home. She had 4 hours. She relieved Evelyn at 7:30. "Normal time, nothing unusual. Thank you. See you Monday. Goodbye." She bathed Micah. She fed him. She put him in his pajamas, the ones with the small elephants on them that she'd bought herself, not from her registry, just because she'd seen them and thought he'd look absurd and wonderful in them, which he did. She held him for a long time before she put him down. She set his monitor. She went to the kitchen. She made dinner for one and ate it standing at the counter because Lucian had texted that he'd be late, a meeting that was running over. And she noted the timing of this with the quiet part of her mind that had been cataloging everything for months. He came home at 10:15. He ate the dinner she'd left covered in the oven. He poured one drink. He took his phone to the study for 30 minutes and then came out and sat on the couch and watched the tail end of something on television. At 11:50, he went to bed. She listened to him moving through the bedroom, the familiar sounds, his watch on the nightstand, the specific exhale of a man sitting on the edge of the bed to take off his shoes, the 2 minutes in the bathroom, the sound of the sleep aid tablet being shaken from its bottle. At 12:20, his breathing from the bedroom had the particular quality of someone who was genuinely under. Nia moved. She had rehearsed it in her head enough times that her body knew the sequence. Micah first. She dressed him without fully waking him, a skill she'd developed over months of practiced necessity, her hands knowing the snaps and the zipper without needing light. She put him in the carrier against her chest. He stirred, made a sound, settled. She went to the closet. She pulled out the duffel she'd packed 3 days ago. She added 4 things she'd kept out deliberately: his health insurance card, his pediatric records folder, her own nursing license documentation, the medication she took daily that she'd managed to quietly obtain a 3-month supply of through the hospital pharmacy. She put on her coat. She picked up the duffel. She went to the kitchen island. She set down the house keys. His keys, technically, because the penthouse was in his name. She set down the USB drive. She took out the note card she'd written 2 nights ago in the hospital parking garage, and she set it beside them. 3 sentences. She looked at them for a moment, then she walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. The elevator came. The doors opened. She stepped inside. And when the doors closed behind her and the elevator began its descent, and the lobby appeared below, and the car she'd called was waiting at the curb with its lights on. When all of that was happening and Micah was warm and breathing against her chest, and 22 floors above them Lucian Vescari was asleep and had no idea, she did not feel triumphant. She felt the way she felt after a long surgery when the patient was stabilized and the immediate crisis had passed, and what remained was the long, uncertain work of recovery. She got in the car. The driver didn't speak. She'd requested that. The city moved past the windows and she held Micah's back with her right hand and watched the lights go by, and she thought, he will wake up and he will find the note and he will open the drive. She thought, and then he will understand what she had been doing while he was so certain she couldn't. The car crossed the bridge. Behind them, Manhattan receded. Ahead of them, the road opened up into the long dark toward Philadelphia, toward Dana's house with the spare room, toward the first morning in 2 years that would belong entirely to Nia and no one else. She did not look back. Dana's house smelled like coffee and dryer sheets. That was the first thing Nia noticed when her sister opened the door at 4:17 in the morning. Not the hour, not the fact that Dana had clearly been awake waiting because she was fully dressed and the kitchen light was already on. Just that smell. Ordinary and warm and belonging to a life that nobody had constructed around her as a trap. She stepped inside. Dana looked at Micah against her chest, then at Nia's face, then at the duffel bag. She didn't say anything. She just stepped back and held the door wider, and that was enough. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs in a t-shirt and sweatpants, took in the scene in about 3 seconds, and said only, "I'll make up the room," and went back down the hall. Nia had always liked Marcus. He was a man who understood when talking made things worse. She sat at Dana's kitchen table and nursed Micah and drank half a cup of coffee that was too strong, and she let Dana sit across from her without filling the silence, which was the greatest kindness her sister could have offered. At 5:30, Micah was asleep in the portable crib Marcus had assembled in the spare room. Nia sat on the edge of the guest bed and looked at the wall, which was painted a color she might have called sage or might have called gray depending on the light, and she thought about nothing for approximately 4 minutes. Just the color of the wall, just the sound of Micah breathing, just the specific absence of 22 floors of Manhattan glass and marble, and the particular brand of silence that a penthouse makes when you are alone in it and afraid. She texted Jonah at 5:45. "We're in Philadelphia." His reply came at 6:02. "Good. Don't answer any calls from unknown numbers today. I'm filing at 9. She set the phone face down on the nightstand. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing. She was asleep within 90 seconds, the hard, involuntary sleep of a body that has reached its limit and simply stopped regardless of what the mind had to say about it. She slept for 3 hours and 40 minutes. When she woke, the house was quiet in a different way. The daytime quiet of a Tuesday, when Dana's kids were at school and Marcus was at work, and the neighborhood was doing its ordinary Tuesday business. She could hear Micah from down the hall, the particular conversational sounds he made when he woke up in a good mood and wasn't yet demanding anything. She got up. She got Micah. She changed him and held him for a while in the pale winter light coming through the guest room window. And she thought about the note she'd left on the kitchen island. She wondered if Lucian had read it yet. She wondered what his face looked like when he opened the USB drive. She pushed both thoughts away. They weren't useful yet. At 9:47, Jonah called. "Filing is in," he said. "Emergency custody petition in Philadelphia County Family Court. Judge has it. We're requesting an emergency hearing within 72 hours based on the documented evidence of the planned custody manipulation and the financial exposure. Will we get it?" "Yes, the documentation is strong. The preemptive filing Lucian's team made in New York actually helps us. It shows intent, and it shows the timeline. His own paperwork proves he's been planning this." What happens when his attorneys respond? They'll file a competing jurisdiction claim. They'll argue New York is the appropriate venue because that's where the marital home is and where Micah has been primarily residing. We counter with the documented evidence that the marital home is not legally Nia's residence in any meaningful sense because of the documents she signed under misrepresentation. He paused. "This is going to move fast, and it is going to be ugly. I need you to prepare yourself for that." "How ugly?" "They will use everything they compiled about your postpartum period. They will present it in the most damaging framing they can construct. You will sit in a courtroom and listen to someone describe your worst weeks as a mother in language designed to make a judge question whether you're fit." She sat with that for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay? I can sit through that. I know what those weeks actually were. I know what I was doing while I was also getting through them. Let them present it." A pause. Something in Jonah's voice shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. "I also need to tell you about the federal situation. I spoke with the lead investigator this morning. The documents you found, particularly the page with Resnick's name and the date, they fill a gap they'd been working around for 8 months. They have enough now to move on Resnick, and when they move on Resnick, they move on Lucian, simultaneously or very close to it. The accounts in your name, your cooperation, and the documentation you provided essentially confirms you are a non-participating secondary holder, which removes your exposure and increases his." He paused. "Nia, I want to be direct with you. The next several weeks are going to require things from you that are beyond what most people are asked to do. You're going to give a formal statement to federal investigators. You're going to sit through family court proceedings that are designed to make you feel small. You're going to do all of this while taking care of a 6-month-old infant in your sister's spare room without the financial resources you had 2 weeks ago. I know. Do you have enough in the savings account to manage for the next month?" 3 months, she said. I was careful. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You were." Lucian called her phone at 10:12 that morning. She watched his name on the screen for 4 full rings. Then she declined the call. Then she screenshot the declined call with the timestamp and sent it to Jonah. He texted back, Good. Do not accept calls from him. All communication through counsel only. Lucian called 3 more times before noon. Then his attorney, not Hargrove, a different one she'd never dealt with, a woman named Sandra Price, who had a reputation that Jonah described as effective and ruthless in that order, called Jonah's office. Jonah relayed the call to Nia that afternoon. She's asserting that you've taken Micah without Lucian's knowledge or consent, and she's characterizing it as parental abduction. Nia's jaw tightened. I left in the middle of the night with my infant son in a duffel bag. I know. And our emergency petition documents the reason for that departure, including the planned custody manipulation that was less than a week from filing. Price knows the petition is in. She's making noise to establish a record, not because she thinks it'll stick. He paused. But Nia, they're going to push for an emergency hearing in New York on the jurisdiction question. Price will request it by end of week. That means you may need to return to New York for a court appearance within 7 to 10 days. I'll be there. It'll be the first time you and Lucian are in the same room since you left. I know. Are you prepared for that? She thought about it honestly. She thought about the last time she'd sat across a kitchen from him, watching him pour scotch and not look at her. She thought about his hand on Valentina's back. She thought about the phrase supervised visitation pending psychological evaluation written in someone else's clinical language about her. Yes, she said. The 10 days that followed were simultaneously the hardest and the most clarifying of her life. She established a routine in Dana's house with the same discipline she'd applied to everything. Micah's schedule, her own sleep, her meals, the calls with Jonah that came every day, and sometimes twice. She did the federal interview by video call from Dana's dining room table while Dana took Micah for a walk, and she answered every question with the same flat precision she used in the trauma bay. And when the investigator, a compact, serious woman named Carla Diaz, whose voice Nia now recognized from the parking garage phone call months ago, asked her to confirm her signature on each document, Nia confirmed it and stated each time that she had not been given adequate opportunity to review or seek counsel, and each time Diaz nodded and made a note and moved to the next question. It took 4 hours. When it was over, Nia sat alone in Dana's dining room and drank 2 glasses of water in succession and looked at the family photographs on the wall. Dana's wedding, her kids at various ages, a beach somewhere from 3 summers ago. Evidence of a life assembled without architecture designed to entrap. She wanted that. She already knew she could build it. She just needed to get through the next part first. The New York hearing was on a Thursday. Dana drove her up. They left at 5:30 in the morning with Micah in the car seat and coffee and travel mugs and a playlist Dana had made that was exactly the right balance of familiar and distracting. They didn't talk much. Dana drove and Nia watched the highway, and Micah slept. And somewhere in New Jersey, the sun came up over the flat industrial landscape, and Nia thought about the last time she'd crossed this distance in reverse, at 1:30 in the morning with her son against her chest. She thought, I will not be afraid of a room. The courthouse was in Lower Manhattan. Jonah met her outside with a younger associate she hadn't met, a woman named Priya, who carried 2 folders and radiated the particular focused calm of someone who had been awake since 4 a.m. preparing. How are you? Jonah asked. Ready. He looked at her face. He's already inside with Price and 2 other attorneys. Okay. The jurisdiction question will take most of the morning. The judge assigned is Frances Okafor. She's experienced in complex matrimonial cases, and she does not like theater. Don't perform. Just answer what you're asked. I know how to talk to people who are managing high-stakes situations, Nia said. I've been doing it since I was 24. Jonah almost smiled. Yes, you have. They went inside. She saw Lucian across the courtroom before the session was called to order. He was in a gray suit she didn't recognize, new, or one he'd never worn around her. His hair was slightly different. He looked like a man who had spent 10 days being very controlled about the fact that he was furious. He sat with Sandra Price on his left and 2 other men she didn't know on his right, and when Nia walked in, he looked up and his eyes found her with an immediacy that told her he'd been watching the door. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she sat down next to Jonah and opened her water bottle and did not look at Lucian again. The jurisdiction hearing was exactly as unpleasant as Jonah had prepared her for. Price was precise and aggressive in the particular way of attorneys who have prepared extensively. She argued New York jurisdiction with a thoroughness that was almost impressive, citing the marital residence, Micah's birth certificate, the preliminary filing, the established domicile. She did not yet deploy the postpartum documentation. She was saving it, Nia understood, for the substantive custody hearing. This was about venue. This was about which battlefield they'd fight on. Jonah countered with the misrepresentation argument that the documents establishing Nia's acceptance of the marital home arrangement had been signed under conditions that vitiated their enforceability, and with the emergency filing documentation laying out in careful sequence the evidence of Lucian's planned custody strategy and the timeline that showed it had been active before Micah was born. Judge Okafor asked questions that were sharp and specific and without apparent emotion. At one point, she looked directly at Nia and asked a single question. Mrs. Vescari, did you have independent legal counsel when you signed the documents referenced in Exhibit C? Nia looked at the judge and said, No, Your Honor. I was told by my husband that they were routine and that counsel was unnecessary. Okafor made a note. Her expression did not change. The hearing recessed at noon. In the hallway, Nia stood with Jonah and Priya and drank half a bottle of water and didn't say anything for 2 minutes. You did well, Priya said. I answered questions. Yes, clearly and without embellishment. That's doing well in there. When the recess ended and they went back in, the session lasted another 90 minutes. At the end of it, Judge Okafor issued a preliminary ruling. Jurisdiction would be determined jointly pending a fuller evidentiary hearing in 3 weeks, with temporary custody arrangements to remain as currently existed, meaning Micah stayed with Nia in Philadelphia, while the full hearing was scheduled. It was not a victory. It was also not a defeat. It was the judge refusing to give Lucian the immediate jurisdiction when his team had been counting on. In the hallway afterward, Jonah spoke quietly. This is better than I expected at this stage. Okafor is not sympathetic to his team's framing, and she read the documents carefully. The next hearing is where it gets decided. Nia nodded. She was putting on her coat. She was thinking about Micah, who was with Dana in the courthouse lobby 2 floors down, and about the drive back to Philadelphia, and about whether there would be traffic. She was thinking about all of this practical and forward-facing when she heard footsteps behind her and then Lucian's voice. Nia. She turned. He had come out alone. Price and the others were further down the hall, in conversation. He was close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes that hadn't been as deep the last time she'd looked at him carefully, which was the night she left. 10 days. He looked like 10 days had cost him something real. She waited. Come home, he said. His voice was low. Not a command. Something more complicated than that. We can fix this. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at a chart with contradictory numbers, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion, making sure she understood what she was actually seeing. There is no home with you anymore, she said. His jaw moved. Nia, whatever you think you found, I don't think anything. I found what I found. You don't understand the full picture. Then explain the custody folder. Explain the accounts in my name. Explain Resnick. She said the last name quietly and watched his face do something. A compression around the eyes, a micro-movement he couldn't fully control. Explain the note that said to confirm with R before filing. Explain why you started planning to take my son before he was even born. The hallway was not empty. There were people at either end of it, lawyers and clerks doing the ordinary business of a courthouse. Lucian was aware of this. She could see him being aware of it, the slight recalibration of how much of himself he was allowing to show in a semi-public space. I was protecting myself, he said. It wasn't by using my name on criminal accounts. That's not by hiring someone to document my postpartum depression as evidence of instability. You were unstable. I was alone, she said. I had a premature baby and no sleep and a husband who wasn't there. That's not instability. That's circumstance. She held his eyes. I know the difference. I'm a nurse. Something crossed his face. Not remorse. Lucian Vescari was not a man who arrived at remorse easily, or perhaps at all, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like the first honest acknowledgement he'd had of what he'd actually done. I gave you everything, he said. She put on her second glove. No, she said. You made me believe everything belonged to you. She walked away from him down the corridor. She did not look back. The 3 weeks between the preliminary hearing and the substantive custody proceeding were a different kind of hard from everything that had come before. Not acute, not the heart-pounding urgency of the night she left, or the coiled tension of the months before it. This was the hard of waiting, of living inside an unresolved thing while also feeding and bathing and reading to a 7-month-old who had begun, in those weeks in Philadelphia, to do something new with his face that she could only describe as smiling with intention. Not the reflexive early smiles, real ones, directed at specific things, at Dana's dog, at his own hands in the bathwater, at Nia's face when she came into his room in the morning. She called Karen and asked about her options for returning to work in a limited capacity while the legal situation resolved. Karen said, "I've been holding your shifts. You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to." A pause. "How bad is it?" "It's being handled." "Do you need anything?" "No, I need to work, actually, mentally. I need to be useful." "Thursday," Karen said, 8 to 4. "I'll have Priya cover the second half so you can get back." She worked Thursday. She worked the following Tuesday. She was not as sharp as she'd been before all of this. There was a layer of noise in the back of her mind that had been there for months and hadn't fully quieted. But she was competent and she was steady, and her patients didn't know the difference, which was the standard she held herself to. The day before the substantive hearing, Jonah called with 2 pieces of information delivered in the same phone call, which told her he'd been waiting until he had both before making it. "The federal indictments came down this morning," he said. "Resnick and 6 associates. Lucian is named as an unindicted co-conspirator, which means they're not charging him yet. They're using him as a thread to pull on, which is actually a more difficult position for him than being charged directly, because it means he doesn't know exactly what they have or what they're going to do with it." And the second thing? Valentina Rourke signed a cooperation agreement with federal investigators 6 days ago. Nia stood at Dana's kitchen window, looking at the backyard where a bird was doing something methodical with the frozen ground. "She's talking," Nia said. "Extensively, apparently. She's confirming the full financial structure of the Lucian-Resnick relationship, including the purpose of the secondary account holders. Her attorney negotiated immunity in exchange for full cooperation." "She's protecting herself." "Yes." "Good," Nia said, and meant it in a way that was more complex than simple. Valentina Rourke had participated in something that had wrapped itself around Nia's life and used her name and jeopardized her child. She did not forgive her for that, but a woman protecting herself from a man who had used her as infrastructure was something Nia understood better than she might have a year ago. "Tomorrow," Jonah said. "Are you ready?" "Yes." "The postpartum evidence, they will present it. Let them. It will be structured to make the worst weeks of your life sound like a pattern of incapacity. And I will sit there and let them finish, and then you will present what I was doing during those same weeks. The savings account, the return to work, the documentation I was gathering, the fact that I am a trauma nurse with 12 years of experience and a flawless professional record who was going through a hard thing and kept going anyway." She paused. "Let them tell their version first. Ours is better." The courtroom the next morning was the same and entirely different from the jurisdiction hearing. Judge Okafor was the same. The layout was the same. But the quality of the air in the room was different. The specific density of a proceeding where something real was being decided, where the outcome would land on actual lives. Price presented for 45 minutes. It was, as promised, thorough and unsparing. The nursing notes Evelyn had compiled, characterized not as surveillance but as concerned observations from a trusted caregiver. The documented instances of emotional distress. The overnight nursing shifts framed as evidence of questionable prioritization. The postpartum period described in language so clinical it stripped the context out entirely, leaving only the symptoms. Nia sat still. She had her hands flat on the table in front of her. Her face was the trauma bay face, present, calm, absorbing without reacting. She watched Judge Okafor, not Price. The judge was reading something while Price spoke. The judge had heard many versions of many stories. When Price finished, Jonah stood up. He was methodical in a way that Nia had come to understand was his particular form of aggression. Not theatrical, not designed to perform for the room, but structured with an internal logic so clear that following it was almost inevitable. He presented the timeline first. The custody strategy folder, dated 11 weeks before Micah's birth. The emails between Lucian and Loomis and Hargrove. The specific language Loomis had used, document behavioral patterns, and the date on which Evelyn had been hired, which was 2 weeks after that email. He presented the documents Nia had signed. The expert he'd retained, a contract attorney who specialized in matrimonial agreements, testified that the documents contained language that a layperson could not reasonably be expected to identify as dispositive, and that their presentation without independent counsel constituted misrepresentation under New York statute. He presented the accounts in Nia's name. Carla Diaz from the DA's office provided a statement that Nia had been identified as a non-participating secondary holder and that her cooperation with the investigation had been material to the case against the primary account holder. He presented Nia's professional record. 12 years. Commendations. A department-wide recognition from 2 years ago. Karen's written statement about the nature of Nia's return to work and her performance on shift. He presented Dana's statement, Marcus's statement, the pediatrician's records, which showed that Micah had attended every scheduled appointment, had received all recommended care, was developmentally on track, and that, in the notes section of 3 separate visits, the pediatrician had recorded that the primary caregiver, the mother, was engaged, knowledgeable, and attentive. Engaged, knowledgeable, and attentive. 3 words from a pediatrician's notes, written in ordinary professional shorthand. Nia heard them and felt something behind her sternum move. Jonah spoke for 90 minutes. Judge Okafor asked questions throughout. She asked Nia 3 directly. When she had first sought legal counsel, what had prompted her to leave the marital home when she did, and whether she understood the scope of the financial documentation she had provided to investigators. To the first, the month after the gala. To the second, she said, I found the custody strategy folder and realized the timeline had moved. I left to protect my son from a plan that had been in preparation before he was born. To the third, yes, Your Honor. I understood what I was giving them. I had read it carefully. Okafor made a note after each answer. The ruling came 4 days later. Jonah called at 2:15 in the afternoon. Nia was in Dana's backyard with Micah on a blanket, watching him work at the complex problem of sitting up independently, which he had been attempting with great seriousness and limited success for 2 weeks. Primary legal and physical custody to you, Jonah said. The judge invalidated the 3 documents Hargrove had you sign, citing misrepresentation and inadequate opportunity to seek independent counsel. The marital home, the penthouse, is being included in the asset division as a marital asset regardless of the title arrangement. Lucian's contact with Micah is restricted to supervised visitation, 2 times per week, to be reviewed at 6 months. Nia was quiet. Micah fell sideways on the blanket and looked surprised about it, and then made a sound she'd come to recognize as his processing sound. Not upset, just recalibrating. Nia, Jonah said, I'm here. Did you hear? I heard. All of it. She watched Micah try to push himself up again. Is it over? The family court portion, for now, yes. The federal case and the civil asset matter will take longer, potentially much longer, but Micah is with you. Your name is clear in the financial investigation, and the agreements he used to control your assets are unenforceable. She put her free hand flat on the blanket next to Micah. Thank you, she said, for believing me when I walked into your office in scrubs and told you what was happening. A pause. You came in with notes, he said. Organized, chronological, and accurate. It's hard not to believe someone like that. She laughed. It was short and real. She hung up the phone and sat in the thin March sunlight with her son on a blanket in Philadelphia and felt the weight of the past 7 months settle differently in her body. Not gone, not light, but changed in quality. Less like something pressing down and more like something she had walked through and come out the other side of still carrying but differently. Micah got himself upright, briefly. For maybe 4 seconds, he sat independently, looking around at the yard with the expression of a person who has accomplished something significant. Then he toppled. She caught him. She always caught him. The months that followed moved with a rhythm that was sometimes painful and sometimes tedious and occasionally unexpectedly beautiful, which was approximately how life moved when you were no longer in crisis and had to figure out what to do with ordinary time. She found an apartment in West Philadelphia, 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, hardwood floors that needed refinishing, and signed the lease herself, with her own name on a document she had read in its entirety before picking up the pen. The landlord, an older man named Gerald, who'd owned the building for 30 years, asked if she needed any help with the move-in. She said she had help. She and Dana carried everything up in 2 trips. She went back to work at the hospital in a consulting capacity through a healthcare technology company that had reached out based on her trauma nursing background and her interest she'd mentioned in a continuing education seminar 2 years before in clinical workflow systems. It was not what she'd planned. She hadn't planned any of this. But it turned out her 12 years in the trauma bay had given her a particular clarity about where systems failed real people in real moments. And that clarity was, apparently, something organizations would pay her to bring to the table. She was good at it. Not immediately. She spent the first 2 months feeling like someone learning a language that used familiar words and unfamiliar grammatical structures. But the discomfort was workable, and the work itself felt honest, felt like it was connected to something real, and she was her own income and her own calendar and her own everything, and the feeling of that did not get old. Lucian's empire did not collapse dramatically. It eroded. The federal case moved slowly, the way federal cases do, and Nia was not centrally involved in most of what followed. She got information from Jonah periodically, in the dry capsule form of legal updates. This investor withdrew. That asset was frozen. These charges were filed. The organized crime operation that Lucian had spent 2 decades building lost its financial infrastructure when Resnick's network was dismantled. And without the money moving cleanly, the loyalty that had always been purchased rather than earned began to dissolve. She heard through Jonah that Valentina had left New York entirely. She didn't ask where. She heard that Hargrove had retired suddenly in a way that suggested the retirement was not entirely voluntary. She attended 2 of Lucian's supervised visits with Micah in the first 6 months, not because she was required to be present, but because Micah was 8 months old and then 9 months old, and the visits were in a facility, and she needed to know he was all right. She sat in a waiting room each time and read medical journals and answered work emails. And when the visit ended and Micah was brought back out, she looked at her son's face for information, the way she looked at a patient's face when checking in, reading the baseline, noting the changes, assessing. Both times, Micah was fine. Whatever Lucian felt during those 1-hour supervised visits with his son in a room with a social worker present, she did not know. She did not try to know. She was not required to manage his grief or his regret, or whatever combination of things a man feels when the infrastructure he built to control his life disassembles piece by piece around him. She had managed enough. Micah turned 1 in April. Dana threw a small party. Their parents drove up from Baltimore. Marcus made a cake that was structurally ambitious and somewhat lopsided. The 2 kids ran around the backyard making noise that was indistinguishable from joy. Nia sat in a lawn chair with a paper plate of food she was actually hungry for and watched her son encounter cake for the first time with the seriousness of a scientist encountering a new phenomenon. He put his entire fist in it. He looked at his fist. He looked at her. She laughed out loud, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere below the chest, unmanaged, real. Her mother sat down in the chair next to hers, a woman who had not said much when Nia had told her what had happened, had listened and held her daughter's hand and not offered easy words, which was its own form of wisdom. She sat next to Nia now and watched Micah investigate the ruins of the lopsided cake and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You look like yourself again." Nia considered this. "I'm not sure I know what that means exactly." "Yes, you do." She looked at her mother's hands on the arms of the lawn chair, the hands of a woman who had worked in a hospital laundry facility and eaten less in January and raised 4 children without flinching, at least not where they could see it. "Yeah," she said, "I do." 3 years passed in the way that years pass when you are building something. Not fast, not the anxious velocity of crisis, but with the particular forward pull of a person who knows what she is building and why, and is willing to do the daily work of it. She advanced at the healthcare technology company. Not because someone championed her, not because she knew the right people, but because she was effective and she could explain complex clinical problems in language that non-clinical people understood, and she showed up and did the work without performing at it. At 37, she was overseeing a clinical innovation division with a team of 11 people, several of whom were more credentialed than she was, and all of whom, she thought, were reasonably glad she was the one in the room. She bought a house. It was smaller than she'd envisioned in some earlier version of herself. 3 bedrooms, a backyard with a maple tree, A kitchen that needed new counters which she had not yet replaced because she was deciding carefully what she wanted, and she was in no hurry. She had learned something in these past 3 years about the specific danger of rushing decisions about the spaces you live in. She put Micah's artwork on the refrigerator. It accumulated until the refrigerator was mostly artwork, which was not elegant, but was exactly right. The final court appearance related to the asset division came on a Tuesday morning in May, 3.5 years after the night she'd left. It was brief and technical. The settlement had been negotiated through attorneys for months, and this was the formalization. She wore a jacket she'd bought herself and flat shoes and no jewelry, and she sat in the courtroom while the terms were read into the record, and she signed what she was asked to sign, having read every word, and then it was done. Outside on the courthouse steps, she stood in the May morning for a moment. The city was doing what cities do in May. The particular return of warmth after a long winter, people moving with slightly more looseness than they'd had in March, jackets open, someone on the corner with coffee. She was going back to work after this. She had a 2 o'clock she needed to prepare for, and Micah had a soccer thing at 5. Not competitive, just a group of 4-year-olds in a park chasing a ball with the communal intensity of a small social organism. She was thinking about this, about the soccer thing, about whether she'd have time to get to the park on the far side, when she heard footsteps on the courthouse steps behind her and turned. Lucian. He had aged in 3.5 years in a way that was visible and specific. Not broken, not diminished exactly, but changed in the way that men change when the structure they built their identity around is no longer there to hold the shape. He was still well-dressed. He was still the same person. But the absolute certainty he used to carry in his posture, the quality of a man who moved through rooms as though they had been arranged for him, that had been reduced to something quieter. He stopped a few steps above her. She waited. "I gave you everything," he said. She had heard this before. She had answered it before, in a courthouse hallway, 3.5 years ago. But this time it wasn't a plea or a negotiation tactic. It came out like something he'd been holding for a long time and had finally stopped knowing what to do with. A statement delivered to the open air, not quite to her, not quite to himself. She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "You made me believe everything belonged to you." She said it the same way she'd said it before, not with heat, not with satisfaction, because neither of those things was what she felt. What she felt was something simpler and more final. The feeling of a sentence that had been true for a long time and remained true and would continue to be true, regardless of how many times it needed to be said. She walked down the rest of the steps. She did not look back. She had somewhere to be. The maple tree in the backyard of the house she owned dropped seeds in a spiral pattern every fall that Micah found interesting enough to collect. He kept them in a jar on the windowsill in his room, the one she'd painted yellow because he'd asked for yellow, and she'd said yes without thinking twice about it. That evening, after the soccer thing, after 45 minutes of watching 8 4-year-olds make their best collective effort at organized movement, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her laptop, and the low, ordinary sound of Micah playing in the next room, some involved narrative he was conducting with 2 action figures and a cardboard box. She wasn't thinking about Lucian. She was thinking about a project proposal she needed to finish, and whether the maple tree needed trimming, and whether Micah would want the same thing for dinner he'd wanted last Tuesday, or whether he was entering a phase of wanting something different. She was thinking about small, real, hers things. After a while, Micah appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was holding a piece of paper. "I made something," he said. She turned. He held up a drawing with the specific pride of a 4-year-old who has put real effort into a thing. A house with a triangle roof, yellow. He used yellow for a lot of things since they'd painted his room, with a sun in the corner that had 17 rays because he'd counted them out loud while drawing. 2 people standing outside, a small one and a tall one. She looked at it for a moment. She felt something move through her that had no precise name. Not happiness exactly, though it was that, and not relief exactly, though it was that too. Something that sat underneath both of those things, quieter and more permanent. "That's us," Micah said, pointing. "Yeah," she said, "that's us." She got up and took the drawing and found space on the refrigerator between a handprint painting and a drawing of a dog. They didn't own, but that Micah had declared they would someday. She put it where she could see it from the table. She went back to her tea. The house settled around them with its ordinary evening sounds. The refrigerator's hum, the action figures clattering in the next room, the maple outside the window doing whatever maple trees do in the particular blue hour before full dark. Once, a man had been so certain she could not survive without his name and his money and his protection that he had built an entire legal and financial architecture around that certainty. He had used her signature, her name, her worst weeks, her love. He had used everything she had given him in good faith and constructed from it a structure designed to keep her in place. She had walked out of that structure at 1:30 in the morning with a baby against her chest and 3 sentences on a note card and a USB drive in her pocket. And then she had built this. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the long, hard, tedious, grinding work of putting one day in front of another when you were exhausted and scared and not entirely sure you were making the right decisions and doing it anyway, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something Nia Bennett had ever known how to do. She had built this. The drawing on the refrigerator, the maple in the yard, the yellow room, the team of 11 people who showed up to meetings she ran, the kitchen that still needed counters, the jar of maple seeds on Micah's windowsill, the specific, unmediated, belonging to no one but her weight of a life that was actually hers. She picked up her tea. She went back to work.